Hi, my name is Dorka, and today I would like to invite you to listen to my presentation on the Lost Island commercial written by Assia Wevill from 1965. So I wanted to give some little bit of background information from Assia. If you're familiar with either Sylvia Plath or tattoos, you probably heard Assia as the other woman in the relationship. Assia was born in 1929 and died in 1969 by suicide. She was a German-born Israeli who moved to various countries, married 3 times as well, and was a very successful copywriter and translator. And she got into a relationship with tattoos in 1962. They never married. They had a child who also died in 1969 when Assia committed a murder-suicide. But besides this very horrific biography, in this presentation, I wanted to focus on her achievement and looking at her as an individual, and not only focusing on the rivalry between Plath and Assia, which has been the forefront of many of biographies and misogynistic narratives on portraying Assia as a sort of femme fatale character in the relationship and Plath as the mad female poetess. Recently, there has been a slow shift towards reclaiming Assia's narrative and looking at her creative bond, looking at the creative bond between her and Plath, and not focusing on the rivalry, as I mentioned, and also demonstrating her achievements and independence from tattoos and who she was as a person, besides being involved in this very complicated love triangle and the aftermath of that as well. So 1965 was also the British publication of Plath's aerial poetry book, which was a huge commercial success. And this was also the year when Wevill's Lost Island commercial reached a success. So even though Plath posthumously got aerial published, it was a very important year, I think, for both of them, and shows a kind of eerie connections as well, both between the two women. And while during their lifetime, they never really reconnected or got over that tragic, the marriage breakdown and all of that, Wevill was also kind of haunted by Plath's suicide, and she craved a connection through her writing. She often read her journals and poetry. And even in the biography, the biographers mentioned that Plath's manuscripts and notebooks were lying everywhere. She had this ambiguous bond between Plath of wanting to connect with her, but also acknowledging that she, or according to Assia, Plath was 100 times or 1,000 times more talented than her. And as I mentioned in this presentation, I want to kind of focus on their shared influences and also what Assia probably took from Sylvia Plath. But for that, we need to watch the Lost Island commercial first.
There were 7 of us. Thousands have tried before. This is where they left their bones. We knew what was waiting. We knew what was waiting for us. The sea witches. The Greeks knew about them. The faces of little women. But their hair is legend. Was this the real location of Eden? Were these the vanished descendants of Eve? There were 7 of us. Men with no hope, only courage. This is what we were after. The hair colors of Sea Witch. Semi-permanent, simple to use. 12 colors. There's one for you. At your chemist. 4 11pence.
So a little bit about the reception of this commercial from 1965. Even probably not to this date, but at that point, it was the most expensive TV commercials And the one we watched was in colors, and that one was shown in a cinema before films, while in the TV there was a black and white version showed in television, because at that point TVs were mainly in black and white. One of the unique features of this ad, which probably doesn't sound unique to you now, but that it had a plot, it had an interesting narrative and storytelling, while at that point commercials, especially beauty commercials, did not focus on having a plot. They were mostly focused on portraying the beauty product to sort of enhance beauty of women, and a kind of romantic sort of narrative. But it's quite humorous and also interrogates complex subjects. It is an ambiguous representation of the sea witches, I think, which I will talk about more in details. They are both monstrous women, and we can also consider them as a sort of embodiment of female empowerment and autonomy. A couple of influences that scholars mentioned in the past, or are mentioned in the commercial itself, is from the Odyssey, which the ad mentions sea witches, and it has influences or allusions to the sirens from the mythology of the Odyssey, and also it alludes to Circe's island, and Circe herself being a sort of goddess witch figure. And the commercial also mentions it alludes to the biblical Eve and the islands of sort of Eden. And while this was maybe not too obvious at first glance, scholars in the past mentioned that it had influences from James Bond films being popular at the time. And the bottom three parts that you can see, these are influences that I perceive. So these are my views, which I will a little bit interrogate them a little bit more. Is influences from Plath's poetry herself, Shakespeare's The Tempest, and the contemporary political context of the British Empire. Moving on, first I would like to talk about the influences from Plath's poetry, particularly the poem Lady Lazarus. So as I mentioned, this ad came out in 1965 when Ariel Plath's posthumously published poetry book was also published. And I also kind of tried to draw an attention to that Assia was really much interested in Plath's writing, and I think she took some influences from her. There are some thematic similarities between The Lost Island and Ariel. We have poems in Ariel about female autonomy, about murderous women, about gender expectations, about death, and even aquatic surfaces appear in the poems. And Lady Lazarus, which is Plath's one of most famous poems about, it's one of Plath's most famous poems, ends with the lines, I rise with my red hair and I eat men like air. So in this narrative, the phoenix-like poetic persona is resurrected. And I think it's particularly shows the influences in The Lost Island because of red hair, and I don't know if you could pay attention to by only looking at the ad only once. You could really see the red-haired witch being in the forefront, and she's also one of the most portrayed as a very beautiful woman, and also one of the murderers of the sea witches. And we can see as well that the sea witch is murdering the men who trying to take their treasured hair dye, which is also connected to the hair. So their power comes from their hair, similar to the phoenix-like figure, whose power also comes from this red hair. She mentions being resurrected like a phoenix. Moving on, I wanted to discuss from this plot point, the sea witches and sort of their power or female power. Because this is the mid-1960s, I think Wevill also builds on the brewing symbol of the witch in second-wave feminist movements. And one of the criticisms of the advert noted, which was published in a newspaper article, that women love to be witches. So half of the name of this news product is well thought of, but I'm not quite enthusiastic about the C. Doesn't it do strange things to your hair? So this was written by someone, an opinion piece, a member of the public, and even this person mentions that women love to imagine themselves as witches, kind of alluding to that context of power and female power and female autonomy as well, and particularly interesting in context of witches having magical power. And in the sea witch ad, it's their hair, it's their beauty, is the one that's alluded to as their power. So there are some ambiguous perceptions here about women and their power. And while obviously the hair dye itself is called the sea witch, which inspired the sea witches themselves, this person kind of doesn't really get the connection between the sea and the hair dye or the witches. I think there's something to think about. What does hair, what does water do with hair? And then how can we think about the sea witches or sea women being in the sea? I mean, we don't see them in the sea. They are in an island, so the hair just stays naturally beautiful. The target audience of this commercial was young women between 60 to 34 age, and the advertising agency had to be very careful in not portray the sea witches killing these men as gruesome. They had to consider some censorship issues. There was even mention of a seagull being too screechy, which could scare children. And Julia Goodspeed Chadwick, one of the forerunners of sort of reclaiming Assia Wells's narrative, noted that The Lost Island asked us to consider what we condone and condemn in femininity. So my next point is about the sort of colonial context of the 1960s, and thinking about that this was a time when the British Empire was in a kind of crisis. There were many colonies that started to gain independence in the 60s. For example, Cyprus, Jamaica, Kenya, Malta, Malawi, and some others. This colonial discourse clearly inspired the Lost Island commercial by its name as well, that we can see the British men traveling to an island and they're looking for a treasure to take away from these sea witches who are constructed as the other and the exotic other. Even though that they're all white women, there's something other about them, and the sailors Indians succeed to take the treasure away. They even name it. They even name the sea witch had a treasure that they take back home to their British wives and to the British women to find the header, the chemist. So this commercial recalls the time of the discovery of the New World and the man seizing the treasure from these islands. Another point another literary influence I wanted to consider is from The Tempest, particularly Sycorax's character, who's a kind of sea witch in The Tempest. Although she's never present, she's mentioned quite a lot. Sycorax, like Circe, she was living in an island, and she's perceived in the play as the other and has transformational powers. Even her name resembles from Circe, or partly comes from, mimics Circe's name. Shakespeare references to Sycorax's Algian origin, and her magical power is often referenced as something not like Prospero's power, is something non-European as opposed to Prospero, and her origin is also not non-European. So in the post-colonial reading of The Tempest, Sycorax and Caliban embodied other whose island is being taken away by Prospero, who is the European kind of colonizer in this context. And The Tempest was also an important influence in Plath's writing. I just wanted to mention again the bond between these two women and possible shared influences. And the last influence I wanted to talk about in connection to the island itself is James Bond, which I think one of the success and the cleverness comes from this Lost Island commercial, is that it takes influences from not just a political, but a kind of pop cultural context of the time. So the first James Bond film came out in 1962, which is called Dr. No. And although there was 4 films that premiered between 1962 and 65 when a commercial was released, the other one I wanted to mention here is the one called Thunderball. And as a kind of general point, we know that I think most of us are familiar with that James Bond's relationship to women, particularly in the older films, is quite sort of misogynistic. And I wanted to mention these films particularly because of their connection to portraying islands. In Dr. No, there is only one scene that includes an island with a woman who becomes the Bond girl of the film. And in the Thunderball, which you can see on the 2-second pictures on the right, the whole film is set around an island in the Bahamas, and it portrays 3 women even whose whole identity and beauty is connected to the island itself. So in all of these Bond films or scenes, we see the women, and they're obviously beautiful women because that's just James Bond anyway, but their identity and beauty is tied to the island. We see these women emerging from the water a lot. You can see in that bikini picture, Domino, sorry, her name, who becomes James Bond lover in Thunderball. So we see these aquatic surfaces as well that function as voyeuristic sites, which allows the narrative to unfold, particularly in Thunderball, where the whole scenery, the whole plot is centered around this island. And in a sort of Cold War narrative, the island just functions as a site of the other, the site in which this Cold War plot is. And these islands are the word of the other, and they're also the word of the enemies. I could talk a little bit more about Thunderball, or if you're interested, leave some questions in the comment, but I'm not going to go into too much detail because of the time. So I just wanted to mention that as well. In the Thunderball, there are 3 women who are connected to Bond, and one of them, who is the femme fatale character, also has red hair. And particularly why Thunderball is so important, because it came out the same year as the Lost Island commercial. And as I mentioned, the Lost Island commercial was showed in cinemas before the films came out. So imagine if you are part of an audience, particularly if you're a young woman who the ad was targeted to, and you're watching the Lost Island commercial, then you're watching Thunderball. You would connect the 2 narratives because they have that build-up of the island, a heroic British man who goes there and saves the day, and then and with the women being around them as well. So as a kind of conclusion, I wanted to highlight that I think the commercial success of the Lost Island lies that it was engaging with the cultural and political context of the mid-1960s, both the brewing second wave feminism and James Bond, and having these particular allusions to even the British Empire. And in the ad, Aquatic Surfaces are representing the other and danger. It is a remote island, even in the name it's called the Lost Island. And it is again, it is not a safety, it is a danger and a threat where the men go and seek the treasure and then immediately leave. I mean, even just one of them survives anyway. And the sea witches are also a kind of embodiment of female power, but also monstrosity. It also has some maybe sexist ideas about beauty and femininity, and men wanting to take that beauty and that beauty being kind of a threat to men, and that's why they want to take away the sea witch head-eye. So the ad playfully navigates between the serious and the humorous, and I think as well it adds to its success. So thank you for listening, and enjoy the conference.